Hey everybody, welcome back to week 2 of being online, and today we're going to talk about aerial, otherwise known as atmospheric perspective, which so far you've been working with geometry, to create the illusion of space and depth. But there's another way to do it. Say if you don't have any architecture to easily facilitate using geometry to depict space, and aerial perspective is where that comes in. As I've noted here, that all of the works that you're going to see here are from the Denver Art Museum, work that I've seen myself. I visited there in 2016, and otherwise there are photos that I've taken myself. I decided to use artwork that I've seen firsthand. I photographed these works not with any kind of agenda in mind, except that they were notable to me and I wanted to record them. So for one thing, that helps me narrow down the countless number of images that I could show you, but hopefully it kind of ties in together all the big picture because there's something that was appealing to me about them. So as I mentioned, with atmospheric perspective, this comes in handy when you don't have linear or geometric shapes to manipulate to create the illusion of depth. So I'm talking about large vistas of nature, things where you have things that are close to you, a mountainscape in the distance. There are a lot of devices you can use to create the illusion of space. So one very basic one is that the objects that are closer to you appear to be larger than an object of the same size that's farther away. And you'll see that in some of the images as we go through here. Another thing is the things that are further away from you are going to be less distinct, less contrasty, less intense in their color, and potentially cooler in color, especially if you're talking about a landscape. Weather effects can also intensify atmospheric perspective, you could say, whether you're in like a high humidity area or a place that's very foggy, and you'll see that also. And clear places with low humidity, it looks very different to those of us who live in rather humid places, and you'll see that too. So in the end, both linear perspective and atmospheric perspective are combined together to create realistic space. Atmospheric really complements linear perspective. So the idea is that you would get comfortable enough with both that you could blend them together in a way that creates an illusion that doesn't look overly forced. So here is a painting of some buffalo, as you can see, by an artist named William Jacob Hayes in 1862. Now this is a very spelled out case for you of a misty situation giving a better illusion of the depth perception of this image, because with some of these, as you'll see in the next slide, the actual further part of the animal clearly looks mistier than a nearer part of the animal. So that front animal, that front bison, very dark, very contrasty. The shadow coming off of its feet are strong. And then the next sort of layer of animals, there's like the one to its right, and it's still pretty dark, the shadow's pretty dark, but as you go back in space, the animals become lighter and their shadows are not nearly as distinct as that front animal. And notice how dark the very foreground of the grass is. You don't think about grass as very dark. That's sort of not a natural assumption. You think about green, but being that it's so close to us, it really works to establish closeness with distance. And this is what I'm talking about, where in the bison that is to the right of the central frontal animal, their face and front haunches appear dark, and then as it recedes back, it becomes a little less distinct. So how about that surface quality of that painting? It's pretty great. It's also worth mentioning that this artist actually used that misty quality to add content to basically create the message of what he was trying to get across, is that these herds of buffalo, as it says here right on the museum wall label, were beginning to disappear. So he depicted them as actually disappearing into the atmosphere. So it's not just a visual device, you can use it conceptually, and this is a great example of that. This is another work from the Denver Art Museum, of course. Worthington Whitridge, 1870. This is a scene from Bergen, Colorado. Now, for your assignment that I've created, I doubt that this is what your view looks like. Number one, we don't have too many mountains around here, but maybe you're very fortunate and live in one of the hillier areas. Anyway, just another example of things that are more distinct in the foreground and the rear of the foreground. Like the trees, I would say that's the rear of the foreground, so to speak. Still quite contrasty as you move back in the image. Not only do the mountains get lighter and less contrasty, when you get back to that last range, they actually get cooler. And yes, I know this is a drawing class. We're not really working with color here. So the next slide is a black and white version of this work, so you could see how that's going to work out for you when you do it in graphite or charcoal. And here it is. Lesson being, don't be afraid to do very strong work, but also super subtle shading in the back. That rear sort of terrace of clouds is barely there, but it still creates a place for the viewer to go, even by being so subtle. And this one is also notable, especially for its color changes. It's super warm, but also this is my photograph that I took in the museum, and in 2 slides you'll see what the museum website actually has, which is going to be a more true image of what this painting actually looks like. So that's another lesson. The images that you take with your camera, and I take with my camera, are not what's really there. They're affected by what the camera can do, the closing of the lens based on exposing on certain parts of the image and the lighting. So the sky in this work is totally blown out, but you'll see there's a lot more detail in it. But again, very bold and dark in the front, very faint as you go back. And yes, this is a painting, but if you were to do this type of an image in, say, charcoal, it would be absolutely stunning to have those rich, velvety dark tones in the front that get lighter as they recede. We don't have such vistas available to us so much. I suppose if you went down to the riverbank or something, you could start to get into this, but it's pretty flat around here. And it's almost hard to believe that this is actually the same work because the color looks so very different and all of the detail that is in those distant mountains and the sky. So this aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective doesn't only come into play when you're depicting a great vista that is 1/3 sky and 2/3 terrain. This image is almost 100% terrain, but it still comes into play because of the scale difference. These clumps of mud and snow in the front are significant in the front, and then as you go back, you lose the clumps of snow and it becomes a tone. And the clumps being brown and rich in the front, and as they recede, they become cooler in their tone. They almost become greenish. So this is a representational painting. However, it's almost a minimalist painting because it's been so reduced in what the viewer is given. This is actually one work. It would be known as a diptych. And it's by Don Stinson in 1998. It is a super detailed set of paintings, but I wanted to give you the overall picture of what this looks like when you're approaching it, and then when you walk up to it, the differences that you perceive. Looks like a very representational painting. Looks like a photograph, you could argue. So he's using some good tricks here. And believe it or not, this is actually part of one of those 2 portions of the painting. It's part of the right-hand side of the painting. past the little structure when you look off into the distance. So a couple of things happening here. You have the decreasing size of those poles. As they are further away from you, the viewer, they reduce in size. Also notice that the greater change is in the bottom of where the poles are going into the ground and less so on the top. Just make note of that. Of course, these are straight out of linear perspective because those lines, the diagonal lines, also known as orthogonals, they are coming out of a vanishing point. In addition to that, you have the nice warm colors in your immediate surroundings, and then as you go back, the colors blew out. Like the furthest mountainscape there is painted in blues. And this is part of the left-hand portion of the painting. Of course, looking through the structure that supports the big sign, I think it's really interesting where this artist has used the framing of those. Of course, this is my image, so I zoomed in on this picture and created a secondary image out of what I saw. So all of these sub-images within the frame of that is another way of creating a sense of distance. You have all these wood forms, and then beyond, you know they're beyond because those forms are in front of those little framed images. And again, blue mountains in the background. And I put this note in here, in your photos through mine, because we don't have ideal situations here. Everybody needs to stay home. And hopefully with your assignment, you can go out and find some kind of a distant space. But if you can even make the observations in your own photos about these things at work, it would be helpful. So I'm just going to show you a few photos that I've taken over time that point out perspective both in linear perspective terms and in atmospheric perspective. This also happened to be from that trip to Denver in 2016. Obviously, I'm leaving. This is a shot from the runway. The tail ends of all those flights, of all those airplanes, clearly are receding as they go toward the horizon and further away from us. The runway lane there is pure linear perspective stuff going on there. Everything disappearing to a vantage point, a single vantage point there. The next slide, you'll see how much work color does, because the red and the blue of those planes really just become a middle gray, and the stripes in the runway. I also just want to add that the contrast that happens from the front of the road toward the back is quite significant. The difference between the white of the snow on the land and the surface of the runway lessens and lessens the further back the image goes. So here is a great combination of linear and atmospheric perspective. Obviously, we're looking at buildings, which you could draft with two-point perspective with no problem, because I know you're all experts now. And then in the distance, you have mountain ranges, and they are much fainter than, say, that brick church-looking building that's right down below us there in the foreground. So the contrast is doing a lot of work here, and then the fainter contrast in the back. This is a photo actually that I took from inside the Denver Art Museum, looking out onto the city itself and what is beyond the city. Again, a lot of this has to do with the limitations of photography. Your eyes can focus on any number of things in succession and sort of read a whole image and not have things overexposed, so to speak. But photographs, at least a single photograph, doesn't do that so much. So the frame around this window and those towels that are lying in the windowsill are the strongest, most contrasty things that are taking place in this image. And the scene outside is fairly bleached out, almost to just a pale, pale gray as you go on. And here's just a close-up of that where you can see how strong and clear the things that are actually in front of you are versus the things that you see through the window. I happened to visit Monticello in Virginia on a very, very foggy day. And I threw this in here because it's kind of surprising how misty the building looks when it's not that far away from me. The most in focus object is that black pole right in the center front. And even the people, as they get closer to the building, become less distinct. This is another example, also another very misty morning. Things are super vibrant and strong in front of you, and then as you go past, they start to fade out. This is a vista looking down on Central Park on a rainy day, and unfortunately, I got rid of the color information on this photo, but strong dark tones toward the viewer, and then receding tones as you get far away. This is actually a landscape in Costa Rica. The place has significantly lower humidity inland than where I happen to live in the middle of the country. And it creates a different sort of atmospheric situation because the things that are far away are still pretty distinct. That's not to say that there's no atmospheric perspective taking place. Those far mountains in the distance are less contrasty, are more blued out, but this is a good illustration of how the air quality affects the illusion of space. So as you approach doing this assignment or any assignment where you need to create the illusion of space, start to take note as you're studying your subject. If there is any effect from the atmosphere or the distance and how you can use that in your drawing, especially pay attention to changes in scale, things that, say for example, cars that are close to you will appear larger than the same car that is halfway down the block. Simple illustration of the change of scale. And hopefully, say if you were going to do a scene looking down a street, down at the end of a block or anything, you'll be able to combine simple, say, one-point perspective and add in the quality of fading values as you recede into space, less contrast, less distinction as you go back.